Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller. This is a little video which I've meant to do for ages, just to show you one of the more neglected publishers who produce science fiction, fantasy and horror, and that's NYRB Classics, New York Review of Books Classics. Now NYRB Classics is of course related to the regular, I think it's fortnightly or is it monthly? I think it's fortnightly magazine, the New York Review of Books, which is like a newspaper. And you can get it in the UK, and it's the equivalent in the UK with the London Review of Books, but the NYRB is much better in my view. And basically they're a reissue imprint. It's rather like Penguin Modern Classics, and I would personally say that even though Penguin Modern Classics is probably the greatest reissue imprint in the world, NYRB is pretty close, and they actually do a lot more unusual things than PMC do in my view. So I'm just going to show you some of the science fiction, fantasy and horror they do. And one thing I really like about NYRB is that they don't really have any boundaries, and it's been going for, I think it's over 20 years. And I discovered them in about 2006 when I read a book called Stoner by a guy called John Williams. And I can't remember how I came across their list, but I really like their livery, which I think is really strong, and the design standard, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And I read Stoner. It's a really good mainstream novel. And funnily enough, a couple of years later, it got mentioned on the radio by Ian McEwan, and it became bestseller. And throughout the years about 2010, 2015, it was a real bestseller, and it's the only time I would genuinely say that I've seen an old novel come back and not just be a 5-day phenomenon, but a true bestseller. So I read it years before anybody else, simply because I like NYRB, and I've bought many books from them just on the way they look. And as a consequence of that, discovered all sorts of fantastic writing in fiction and non-fiction from the past. And they're very wide-ranging. They go right the way back a couple of centuries and right up until quite recently. And as you see, they're very beautiful. They all have this wonderful little oblong here, which text block, which has different colours in it. And I just thought we'd go through them and show some of them to you. If I collected any publisher completely, if I was a completist, you know I'm not, if I was going to collect every book ever published by a certain publisher and a certain imprint, it would be NYRB, and I think they're absolutely fantastic. So here on the far left we have Compulsory Games by Robert Aikman, and Aikman was a British short story writer. He wrote one novel, a mainstream novel. He wrote a lot of what he called strange stories. I guess we would call them weird fiction. Some of them are horror. They're very surreal. They're very fantastic. There's nothing quite like them. He goes in and out of fashion. He's always been quite a small cult. Faber do about 4 of them, and I sell them really regularly to horror fans, and they're really quite something. They're really great. They fall sort of in between, if you can imagine somebody being in between Ramsey Campbell and Angela Carter, you get the idea. But it's not sort of blood and guts horror, it's more subtle than that. He's quite an interesting character as well, and he was responsible with the writer LTC Rolt, who was basically an engineering writer. They did a lot of work to curate and preserve and bring back to life a lot of British canals. So there's a sort of sideways thing there. And this is Compulsory Games, which is a really big, chunky collection of stories. And what you'll see is that, there you go, it has coloured wraps on the inside, and that's their list in the back. And when I first discovered NYRB, what I liked about it was that a lot of the books in it are books which used to be Penguins in the UK years ago, and the licensing had changed. For example, is that there are 2 Kingsley Amis titles in NYRB Classics. The Alteration, which is an alternate world SF novel, and also his ghost novel, The Green Man, both of which are excellent. And I don't have those in NYRB because I've got sort of first editions in Jonathan Cape anyway, and they're not available in the UK because in the UK the rights are held by Penguin, so you can't buy them in the UK. You have to go online and get them from the States. So I'll show you those sort of things, and as I'm not a completist, I wouldn't buy everything anyway, but they are very handsome indeed. So in the middle here we have The Stronghold by Dinu Buzzati, and that is the new translation of a book which is normally known as The Tartar Step. And if you watch my last video in which I reviewed this book, The Singularity by Dinu Buzzati, you'd have heard me mention that I did a video about The Stronghold aka The Tartar Step, some time ago, and I'll link again to that because it is, quite frankly, the most profound and moving literary fantasy novel I've ever read. It really is quite something. It is one of the best books I've read this century. It comes from the 30s. And the singularity there, my review of that is in the last video, the one in which I talked about going beyond Peter Watts's Blind Sight and looking at similar things. And that was first published in 1962. So they're rather a sober looking lot to open our examination of NYRB's work on the fantastic. Three more here, and if you look at the NYRB website, you can filter it by genre, and there's a bit for science fiction and there's a list for horror. There isn't for fantasy because they don't sort of designate anything as fantastic, because really the sort of fantastic books on their list are too broad. None of them come into fantasy in terms of sword and sorcery or high fantasy or epic fantasy, as the kids call it these days. So they don't have that, but they do have SF and horror. And on the left here is Moderan by David R. Bunch with a foreword by Jeff Vandermeer. And I think I mentioned that. I have mentioned it several times on the channel. I think it's in my New Wave USA video from about a year and a half ago. And two stories from Moderan were in Dangerous Visions, the Harlan Ellison anthology. And it's a very sort of, how can I put it? It's a very literary collection of short stories, which you could argue make a fix-up novel. I would say it's really a short story collection set in a future world where people are gradually replacing their organs with machinery and plastic and becoming cyborgs. And it's very sort of witty and verbally quite inventive and satirical, and it wouldn't appeal to everybody, and it's very sophisticated, and it's a book which like goes in and out of print. I mean, my first copy was a very ancient A-format paperback, and this one is available in the UK and very, very beautiful, as you can see. And for anybody who likes things about the question of what is real and authentic, and who also likes satirical and dystopian SF, I really recommend Moderan. I think Matt at Bookpurl reviewed it recently and he loved it, and which is no surprise, so I can usually tell what Matt's going to like. But yeah, it is very good indeed. So that's out there for you to grab. And just to show you, the spines of the books have individual colouring, and I think in one way one of the weaknesses of their design standard is that they don't have one colour, so you put them on the shelf together and it's like a rainbow, which I personally like. But I think in some ways it's interfered with the way that a more common livery in terms of the spine and the text box there would really sort of pull that together. Which brings us to the book in the middle, which is The Invention of Morel by Adolfo Bioy Casares, a Latin American book with a prologue by George Louis Borges. And Casares is really important quasi-father of magical realism. And as you see, the cover there depicts, that's a still of Louise Brooks, the silent film actress. And Casares was rather obsessed with her. And The Invention of Morel is generally believed to be the inspiration for the New Wave French film. And by New Wave in this sense, we don't mean New Wave science fiction. We mean New Wave cinema, which was a movement in European cinema back in the late 50s, early 60s. Largely a French movement of new approaches to cinema, and I guess in a way it started in Italy with things like Rome Open City just after the war and neorealism, and that fed into new wave cinema, Nouvelle Vague, and that's where Christopher Priest took the term new wave, Nouvelle Vague, new wave, and applied it to SF and a fanzine before it got taken up as a bit of a label for what was happening in science fiction in the late 50s and particularly in the early 60s as it got more experimental and modernistic. And as I say, The Invention of Morel inspired Lasher and Marienbad, and it's generally regarded as being a book which is kind of about virtual reality and what is real and one man's obsession with a woman and memory and perception. And I know that Chris was very, very fond of it. And it's a fascinating novel. It's very short and it's well worth the read if you're interested in the kind of cognitive dissonance and questions about perception and reality that Chris Priest particularly was big on. In fact, on the back, it makes a comparison to Philip K. Dick. It's, what does it say here? Borges declared The Invention of Morale as a masterpiece of plotting comparable to The Turn of the Screw. That's Henry James, of course. This is a fantastic exploration of virtual realities that bears comparison with the sharpest work of Philip K. Dick. I would say it's a little bit more misty than that and more Preistian, but it is a fantastic book and well worth looking at. Interestingly, on the NYRB site, it doesn't come up in the science fiction bit, and funnily enough, they're quite loose in their definition. They look beyond the idea of genre SF. The Glass Bees by Ernst Junger used to be a Penguin Modern Classic back in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, and this is an edition with an introduction by Bruce Sterling. And Ernst Junger was a German writer, or was he Swiss? I think he was German, and he wrote quite a number of things. And no, he was German because he was a German military figure. His most famous book is called Storm of Steel, which is a book that he wrote and rewrote many times about his experiences in the Wehrmacht. And he was quite active in World War I and World War II, and Hitler really didn't like him, but he had to have him on board because he was an important military figure. And also he used to spend time hanging out with Albert Hofmann, the creator and discoverer of LSD, lysergic acid diethylmolide, and that's where I'm thinking Switzerland, because Hofmann was Swiss. And of course in Switzerland some people are Germanic, they speak German, some speak French, some speak Italian, depending on what part of Switzerland they're at. And this is a dystopian novel, and I remember the first time I read this was when I stocked American imported copies at my shop that I opened in Swansea back in 1995. And it's set in the future, and it's about global domination, and it was published in 1960, and it is good, and Sterling's introduction is very interesting. So as you see, in choosing people like Vandermeer and Sterling, they're very much pulling it into the contemporary relevance of what's been happening in SF for the last 30 years. This tranche gives you a real feel of the international base of NYRB, as we present an Italian novel, a British novel, and a collection of American short stories. And first of all, we have Dissipatio HG, The Vanishing, by Guido Morselli. And Morselli's obscure Italian figure. He committed suicide shortly after writing this. And Dissipatio, dissipation. It is a very dissipated book, actually, and there's a feeling of despair about it. And it's about the last man on earth. Everybody has disappeared. The Vanishing is called. And he goes to this strange city where he thinks he might find somebody still alive, and it's his reflection on life, the universe, and everything. And I have to say, it didn't blow me away, but when I was reading it, I was in quite a sort of ambiguous sort of frame of mind, so I really need to go back to and look again. It's quite brief, and I think I need to give it more attention, and I'm fascinated by Italian literature generally, as you know. So that's an interesting one I need to look back at. I don't think I put enough effort into it, so my next reading will be a bit more attentive. Then in the centre, we have the American edition of Inverted World. Now, Inverted World is getting covered a lot more on SF BookTube these days, probably because there's been a Masterworks edition for quite some time. Despite Priest's massive critical acclaim, despite the film of The Prestige from 2006, he still remains an obscure figure to many of the more vanilla SF readers. And what you'll notice here is that this book has Inverted World, not The Inverted World. Because in the States, it was always called The Inverted World, which is an incorrect title, and the correct title was Inverted World. Why is this a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because there's a shorter version of this story called The Inverted World, which was published first in an issue of New Writings in SF. And then when the book was written to its full length and published in the States, it got called The Inverted World, which was a mistake. In the UK, it's always been Inverted World. So you see the attention to detail that NYRB have brought there by putting the proper, correct original title there. And you'll see there's an afterword by John Clute as well. And if you watch my interview with Chris Priest, the first part of it, I think it's the first part, we talk about this. And we talk about whether it's a hard SF novel or not. And Chris says it's definitively not. And in this afterword, I think John Clute says it is a hard SF novel. And Chris remarks that, you know, this is about the only time he'd ever disagreed with John, because John is the world's greatest sort of living SF critic. So that's a great edition of Inverted World to buy for in the States. So if you're an American reader and you watch his channel in the States, this is an edition to go for, and it's very, very handsome, as you see, and it really does suit Priest's writing, very cold and calculating and self-collected and distancing and cognitively dissonant, and I think it really works really well. I absolutely love that cover. I think it's fantastic. Then we have Store of the Worlds, The Stories of Robert Sheckley, edited by Alex Abramovich and Jonathan Lethem. Jonathan Lethem, I covered his novel As She Climbed Across the Table in my last video. Great writer. And this is an amazing selection of Sheckley's work. It's a good chunky book. It's a good 300 pages long. And what it does, it starts, I think, with The Seventh Victim. I think it's the first story in there, the classic kill game story. And, you know, everybody's ripped off Sheckley since then, basically. And, of course, he was a satirical writer. Douglas Adams plagiarized him dreadfully, it has to be said. And what's interesting about this is you see the way that the writing goes is that the editors have gathered together the book, the stories, in kind of a thematic way. So you might get 3 stories in a row which have similar themes or similar sort of subject matter, and it works really well as a major retrospective for Sheckley. And is it the best way to read Sheckley the first time around? I would so go with a shorter collection, but it is such a beautiful, beautiful book, and I've sold absolutely loads of this in work. It did go out of print briefly. I think it's back now, but absolutely lovely to see one of the masters of 50s social SF get collected this way in a really handsome edition. And it would be nice to see this happening with a lot more genre SF, because, you know, these are really classy looking books. I think you'd agree. Then we have a bit of cosmic horror from William Sloane, with an introduction by Stephen King, The Rim of Morning. And there are 2 novels in this omnibus edition. Sloane is a fairly obscure figure, and I bought this some time ago, and it contains 2 novels, To Walk the Night and The Edge of Running Water. And I was really peeved because I had to get this, I think, from Amazon.com, and it came with sort of dinged edges. That really wound me up, because there's such beautiful books and I'm not going around to reading it. I know some of you out there have, and you'll have comments to make on it, but I think you'd agree that's a stunning jacket. And these apparently are sort of like Lovecraft, but a bit more well crafted and a bit more literary. I can't say I know that much about them. I've read bits about them, but I don't really want to comment anymore until I read it myself. In the centre is one of a number of books that NYRB do by Vladimir Sorokin, who's a contemporary Russian writer who isn't very popular with Vladimir Putin, let's just say that. His trilogy, Ice Trilogy, is in NYRB, and I think there's another one as well, or maybe there's one coming. There's certainly 2 in Penguin Modern Classics. And Sorokin very much uses SF conceits and scenarios to satirize contemporary Russia and its concerns. And I mean, you read the back of this book and it sounds utterly bizarre. I read the Ice Trilogy, I've not read this yet, and I'm just going to grab hold of it and take it out of the frame a minute. This is a book which is pretty interesting. When it was first published, 1999, a load of Putin supporters got together and tore copies of it up and threw them into a enormous papier-mâché toilet, which is just wild. And it's about clones and people who exude this strange blue lard out of their back, and it's utterly, utterly bizarre. And he's a very postmodern writer, and he's very, very hard to pin down. And in some ways, I think it actually says in the introduction or the notes that, you know, this is a book which is quite hard to read, but you kind of have to have it as an artifact. And with the Max Ernst cover, well, I kind of had to have it really. So I don't know if I'll get on with it, because he can be very difficult. But there you go. I guess that shows you the state of the art of Soviet satirical SF now that the Strugatskys have gone. Quite recently from NYRB, My Death by Lisa Tuttle. Lisa Tuttle, of course, lives in Scotland. She's a Texan writer. She was known Her first book was the collaboration she did with George R. R. Martin, Windhaven. That was the first book, and they were sort of, I think they had a thing going on then. And later on she was married to Christopher Priest, funnily enough. And Lisa's written lots of great SF stories, ghost stories, horror, and this is a horror novelette. I haven't read it yet. It was first published by PS Publishing, and again, very, very beautiful stuff. I think you agree. And it's making me realise I've got quite a few books in NYRB I haven't read yet, and this only came out a few months ago, as I say. Nice brown livery, and it's really interesting to see something from PS or from a small publisher suddenly get picked up by one of the most prestigious reissue imprints in the world. And it's just goes to show sometimes you just wish the editors of these places would look at what's happening in genre, and they clearly have in this case. And it's really, really nice to see Lisa get a book in such a prestigious imprint, and I'm looking forward to reading that at some point. Ending now with two favourites, two of John Wyndham's books. On the left are the Chrysalids, and this edition of the Chrysalids, which is still in print, has an introduction by Christopher Priest. The equivalent UK edition would be the Penguin Modern Classics edition, which has an introduction by M. John Harrison, and I've got all of these, of course. I will tend to buy a book even if it's got an introduction by Chris or M. John, because they do such good ones, even if it's a book I've already got. And I see that as a sort of part of the corpus of their critical work. And on the right, Chalky by John Wyndham, again with an introduction by Margaret Atwood. I would prefer if it wasn't Atwood. For me, I've never really liked Atwood. She's never sat well with me. I don't like some of the things she said about science fiction. I don't like the way she's tried to sort of block off genre SF by going on about speculative fiction. I don't think The Handmaid's Tale is a great book. Personally, I think it's very clunky and crude as a dystopia. And I also get rather with people who think that, you know, that was the beginning of feminist SF. And I was speaking to some young ladies in my job yesterday who were looking at books and sort of talking about books, and it was a really interesting discussion. They were really nice, and I was saying to them, you know, you should really try some Joanna Russ. And I said, feminism in genre fiction didn't really begin with Margaret Atwood. And one of them said, oh, that's controversial. And I said, it's not controversial, it's simple fact. I said, you know, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, that's what was really happening. If you go back to women's press in the 80s. So, but Atwood to me has always been a sort of Jenny come lately, as it were. But that aside, this is Chalky, which is one of Wyndham's late books, of course, and it's a great book. And of course, it's a book about a child. It's a book about alien contact. And, you know, it's probably the nicest edition there's ever been of Chalky. I think that's absolutely beautiful. But I think that one is out of print now. And I'll try and bring you some more unusual publisher things soon. So you won't always see these covered very well in British bookshops. You can get most of them online, of course. And they do lots of other wonderful, wonderful stuff. They do all sorts of things. Historical novels, classics you'll be familiar with, classics you'll be unfamiliar with, modern classics, non-fiction. Absolutely marvellous, beautiful books. So that's NYRB and some of the SF, fantasy and horror that they publish under their imprint. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. And I'll see you again soon.